Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're trading desert sands for Caribbean waves as we explore Jamaica, an island that somehow managed to influence global culture far beyond what its size should mathematically allow. This is the place that gave us Bob Marley, Usain Bolt, and jerk seasoning, which frankly should qualify it for some kind of international achievement award. From the misty blue mountains where the world's most expensive coffee grows, to coral reefs that make tropical fish look like they're showing off, Jamaica packs more geographical diversity into 4,000 square miles than seems physically reasonable. We'll discover how this small island became a cultural giant, survived centuries of dramatic historical upheaval, and continues to punch well above its weight class on the world stage. Tonight's journey takes us from ancient Taíno villages through Spanish Conquest, British Plantation society, and the long road to independence, all while exploring the stunning geography that shaped every chapter of this remarkable story. If these deep dives help you unwind after long days, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps us reach fellow history lovers who need their nightly dose of soothing facts and questionable historical jokes. So grab your favourite blanket, settle into that perfect sleep position, and let's begin our exploration of Jamaica, the island that proves good things definitely come in small, incredibly influential packages. Chapter 1: Island Origins and Early Inhabitants. Picture this. Millions of years ago, long before anyone was worried about missing their morning coffee, the Caribbean was essentially a geological construction site. Tectonic plates were having what can only be described as a very slow-motion wrestling match, pushing and shoving with the patience of saints and the determination of someone trying to parallel park in a space that's clearly too small. Jamaica emerged from these ancient oceanic depths like a sleepy giant stretching after the world's longest nap. The island formed through a complex dance of volcanic activity and sedimentary deposits, creating what would become the third largest island in the Caribbean. At roughly 4,400 square miles, it's about the size of Connecticut, though significantly more musical and with considerably better weather. The Blue Mountains, Jamaica's spine of peaks reaching over 7,000 feet above sea level, began their slow rise during this geological drama. These mountains would later become famous for producing some of the world's finest coffee, because apparently even mountains need their morning caffeine fix. The Blue Mountain Peak stands as the island's highest point, offering views that would make even the most jaded Instagram influencer weep with joy. As geological time ticked by, and we're talking about the kind of time that makes waiting for a delayed flight feel like a quick bathroom break, Jamaica's landscape diversified into a remarkable variety of terrains. Limestone-cast topography created a wonderland of caves, sinkholes, and underground rivers. The cockpit country, despite its unfortunate name that never fails to make geography students giggle, became a labyrinth of cone-shaped hills and deep valleys that would later prove perfect for hiding from colonial authorities. The island's rivers began carving their paths to the sea, creating valleys that would become crucial arteries for both ancient and modern civilizations. The Rio Cobre, Black River and Rio Grande established drainage patterns that transformed Jamaica into an island of diverse ecosystems. Coastal plains developed along much of the shoreline, offering the perfect combination of fertile soil and access to the sea. Essentially, beachfront property with agricultural potential. As the climate settled into what we might generously call perpetually pleasant, Jamaica became a paradise of biodiversity. Tropical rainforests claimed the mountains, while dry forests adapted to the southern coastal regions. Wetlands flourished in low-lying areas, creating habitats that would support everything from crocodiles to an impressive variety of birds who clearly had excellent taste in vacation destinations. Into this geological paradise came Jamaica's first human inhabitants, arriving sometime between 1,000 and 2,500 years ago. These were the Taíno people, though calling them first might be slightly inaccurate. They were actually the latest in a series of indigenous groups who had been calling the Caribbean home for thousands of years. Think of them as the most recent tenants in a very long-term lease agreement with Mother Nature. The Taíno, whose name means good people in their own language, which shows admirable self-confidence, were part of the larger Arawakan linguistic family. They had migrated northward from South America, island hopping through the Caribbean like ancient backpackers with surprisingly sophisticated maritime skills. Their journey to Jamaica represented the culmination of generations of seafaring knowledge passed down through families who apparently never met a horizon they didn't want to explore. When the Taíno arrived in Jamaica, they found an island that must have seemed like winning the Geographical lottery. Fresh water flowed from mountain springs, fertile valleys offered perfect conditions for agriculture, and the surrounding seas teemed with fish who seemed almost eager to become dinner. The climate was warm but not oppressive, with trade winds providing natural air conditioning that would make modern developers weep with envy. The Taíno called their new home Xaymaca, which translates roughly to land of wood and water. It's a name that captures the essence of Jamaica with the kind of poetic accuracy that would make modern tourism boards frantically take notes. Wood and water, two things essential for survival, abundant on the island, and far more romantically described than place with trees and rivers, which lacks a certain marketing appeal. These early Jamaicans developed a sophisticated society that was perfectly adapted to their island environment. They weren't the stereotypical primitive people that colonial accounts would later portray, a narrative about as accurate as claiming that pineapple belongs on pizza, which is to say, hotly debated and probably wrong. The Taíno had complex social structures, sophisticated agricultural techniques, and artistic traditions that would influence Caribbean culture for centuries to come. Taíno society was organised around villages called ukaigs, each typically housing between 1,000 and 3,000 people. These weren't random collections of huts thrown together by people who couldn't be bothered with urban planning. Instead, they were carefully designed communities centred around a central plaza called a beiti, where social, religious and recreational activities took place. Think of the beiti as the ancient equivalent of a community centre, minus the awkward potluck dinners and arguments about who forgot to clean the coffee maker. The villages were ruled by chiefs called caciques, both male and female, who inherited their positions through a complex system that prioritised maternal lineage. This matrilineal approach to leadership was remarkably progressive, especially considering that European societies of the time were still debating whether women had souls, a question that says more about European intellectual capacity than it does about women's spiritual worth. Taíno agriculture was a masterpiece of sustainable farming that modern agricultural scientists study with the kind of reverence usually reserved for ancient texts or really good barbecue recipes. They developed a system called conuco, raised mounds of soil where they grew multiple crops together in what we now call companion planting. This wasn't just efficient, it was brilliant environmental management disguised as common sense. The three main crops, corn, beans and squash, were known as the Three Sisters, a name that suggests both agricultural wisdom and the kind of family harmony that makes holiday dinners actually enjoyable. Corn provided structure for beans to climb, beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn and squash leaves shaded the soil to retain moisture and suppress weeds. It was permaculture, thousands of years before permaculture became a buzzword that makes gardening enthusiasts insufferably smug at dinner parties. Beyond the Three Sisters, the Taíno cultivated sweet potatoes, yams, peppers, cotton and tobacco. They also grew cassava, a root vegetable that would become crucial to Caribbean cuisine, and has the distinction of being both nutritious and capable of being toxic if prepared incorrectly. Nature's way of keeping cooking interesting. The Taíno developed sophisticated techniques for processing cassava safely, knowledge that would prove invaluable to later populations who didn't fancy accidentally poisoning themselves while making dinner. The Taíno supplemented their agricultural diet with hunting, fishing, and gathering. Jamaica's waters provided abundant fish, lobster, and other marine life that could be caught using nets, hooks, and weirs, ingenious fish traps that channeled schools into confined areas. On land, they hunted birds, iguanas, and a variety of smaller mammals using bows, spears, and blowguns, with the kind of accuracy that would make modern Olympic archers nervously adjust their equipment. Their material culture reflected both practical needs and aesthetic sensibilities that produced some of the most beautiful artifacts in the pre-Columbian Caribbean. Taíno ceramics, with their distinctive geometric patterns and animal motifs, weren't just functional vessels. They were works of art that happened to be excellent for storing water and cooking food. Their pottery reveals a society that valued beauty alongside utility, understanding that there's no reason functional objects can't also make your home look fantastic. The Taíno were master carvers, creating ceremonial objects, furniture and canoes from Jamaica's abundant hardwoods. Their wooden seats, called dujos, were carved with intricate designs and served both practical and spiritual purposes during religious ceremonies. These weren't just chairs, they were thrones for communication with the spiritual world, furniture that doubled as religious technology. Speaking of spiritual matters, Taíno religion was a complex system that saw the divine in natural phenomena, ancestral spirits, and powerful supernatural beings called Xaymaca. These weren't distant, judgmental deities demanding complicated rituals and substantial donations. They were active participants in daily life who could be approached through ceremonies, offerings, and the kind of personal relationship that made prayer feel more like conversation than begging. The Cahoba ceremony was central to Taíno religious practice, involving the ritual inhalation of powdered seeds that induce spiritual visions. Before anyone starts getting ideas about ancient recreational drug use, these were serious religious ceremonies conducted by trained shamans called bahiks, who spent years learning the proper techniques, spiritual protocols, and medical knowledge necessary to guide these experiences safely. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of licensed therapists, but with better understanding of plant medicine and considerably more colourful ceremonial attire. Taíno society was remarkably egalitarian compared to contemporary European civilizations. While they had social hierarchies, these were generally based on merit, age, and spiritual knowledge, rather than inherited wealth or military conquest. Women held significant power and could inherit leadership positions, own property, and participate fully in religious and political activities. This level of gender equality wouldn't be seen in European societies for several more centuries, making Taíno culture remarkably ahead of its time in recognizing that competence isn't determined by chromosome configuration. The arrival of the Taíno in Jamaica marked the beginning of sophisticated human civilization on the island, but they weren't starting from scratch. Archaeological evidence suggests earlier indigenous populations, including the Redware people and possibly even earlier groups whose names have been lost to time. Each wave of settlement built upon the knowledge of their predecessors, creating a rich cultural foundation that would influence Jamaica long after the Taíno themselves had largely disappeared from the historical record. By the time Columbus arrived in 1494, Jamaica was home to an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 Taíno people, living in over 200 villages across the island. They had created a sustainable civilization that had flourished for centuries, developing sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, medicine, astronomy, and environmental management. Their society represented one of humanity's successful experiments in living harmoniously with their environment while maintaining complex social, political, and religious institutions. The Taíno legacy in Jamaica extends far beyond archaeological artifacts and historical footnotes. Many Jamaican place names derive from Taíno words, including Jamaica itself from Xaymaca. Words like hurricane, tobacco, hammock, and barbecue entered global vocabularies through Taíno language, linguistic gifts that continue to enrich human communication centuries after their civilization was disrupted by European contact. As we prepare to explore Jamaica's encounter with European colonialism, it's worth remembering that the island's first chapter was written by people who understood that true wealth isn't measured in gold or territory, but in the ability to live well within the natural abundance that surrounds us. The Taíno created a civilization that lasted longer than most European empires and left cultural influences that continue to shape Caribbean identity today. Not bad for a society that supposedly lacked the sophistication of their eventual conquerors. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, picture Jamaica as it was before the arrival of European ships, an island paradise where indigenous people had created a sustainable way of life that honoured both human needs and environmental limits. It's a vision of what's possible when people work with nature rather than against it, and a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated solutions are also the most elegant. Sweet dreams, and in the next chapter we'll discover what happened when two very different worlds collided in the Caribbean sunshine. Chapter 2: Colonial Encounters and Spanish Rule. On May the 4th, 1494, Christopher Columbus made his second landing in the Americas, stepping onto Jamaican shores at what is now called St. Anne's Bay. The date would later become famous for entirely different reasons involving space operas and terrible puns. But on that particular morning, it marked the beginning of a collision between two worlds that would reshape an entire island's destiny. Columbus, who had the geographical confidence of someone using a GPS that was consistently wrong but refusing to admit it, had been searching for a passage to Asia. Instead, he found Jamaica during his second voyage to the Caribbean, and his first reaction was apparently to name it Santiago, after St. James. This name didn't stick, possibly because the Taíno had already spent centuries calling it Xaymaca, and indigenous people tend to be rather attached to names they've been using since before Europeans figured out the earth was round. The Spanish explorer described Jamaica as the fairest island that eyes have beheld in his letters to the Spanish crown, which was either genuine appreciation for natural beauty or the kind of promotional exaggeration that would make modern real estate agents proud. Given that Columbus was essentially in the business of convincing Spanish monarchs to fund expensive ocean voyages, a little marketing enthusiasm was probably inevitable. Columbus's encounter with the Taíno was initially peaceful, though this had more to do with Taíno hospitality than Spanish restraint. The indigenous people, following their cultural traditions of welcoming strangers, offered food, water and assistance to these oddly dressed visitors who had arrived in impossibly large canoes with white wings. The Taíno couldn't have known they were greeting the advance guard of a colonial system that would fundamentally alter their way of life. The Spanish, for their part, were impressed by Jamaica's natural wealth but disappointed by the apparent absence of gold deposits. This was unfortunate timing for the Taíno, because Spanish colonial policy operated on the principle that if you didn't have gold, you could become the labour force to find gold somewhere else. It was a remarkably efficient system for creating wealth in Spain, while simultaneously destroying societies in the Americas. Columbus returned to Jamaica in 1503 during his fourth voyage, but this time as an unwilling guest rather than an explorer. His ships, riddled with shipworm damage and leaking like medieval sieves, were beached at St. Anne's Bay, where he and his crew spent over a year stranded. This extended stay gave the Spanish their first prolonged contact with Taíno society, though the relationship grew increasingly tense as months dragged on and European food demands strained local resources. During this marooned period, Columbus demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that would make him either a brilliant survival instructor or a terrible house guest, depending on your perspective. When the Taíno grew reluctant to continue providing food for over 100 unexpected long-term visitors, Columbus consulted his astronomical tables and discovered that a lunar eclipse was scheduled for February the 29th, 1504. Columbus informed the Taíno leaders that his god was angry about the reduction in food supplies and would demonstrate divine displeasure by eating the moon. When the eclipse occurred exactly as predicted, the Taíno were sufficiently impressed, or possibly just eager to get rid of their astronomically informed guests, to resume food deliveries until rescue ships finally arrived. It was an early example of using superior technology to maintain colonial dominance, though considerably less violent than most subsequent Spanish tactics. The formal Spanish colonization of Jamaica began in 1510, when Juan de Esquivel arrived with a mandate from Diego Columbus, Christopher's son, who had inherited his father's position as governor of the Indies along with his questionable navigation skills but considerably better political connections. Esquivel established the first permanent Spanish settlement at Sevilla la Nueva, or New Seville, on the north coast near present-day St. Anne's Bay. The choice of location demonstrated that the Spanish had learned approximately nothing about tropical settlement planning during their previous Caribbean adventures. Sevilla la Nueva was built in a swampy area that bred mosquitoes with the enthusiasm of a medieval plague and provided perfect conditions for tropical diseases that would make colonist mortality rates resemble those of particularly dangerous extreme sports. The Spanish colonial system in Jamaica was based on the encomienda, a legal framework that was essentially slavery with more paperwork and better public relations. Under this system, Spanish colonists received grants of land along with the indigenous people who lived on it, ostensibly to provide religious instruction and protection in exchange for labour. In practice, it meant that Taíno people became unpaid workers on their own ancestral lands, which was the kind of legal innovation that made Spanish lawyers very proud and everyone else considerably less so. Juan de Esquivel implemented the encomienda system across Jamaica with the efficiency of someone organizing a potluck dinner, if potluck dinners involved forced labor and the systematic destruction of indigenous culture. Spanish colonists received grants that divided the island into manageable portions, each including the Taíno villages and agricultural lands necessary to make colonial ventures profitable. The impact on the Taíno population was catastrophic and swift. European diseases, to which indigenous people had no immunity, spread through Taíno communities like wildfire through dry grass. Smallpox, typhus, measles, and influenza killed thousands of people whose ancestors had lived on the island for generations without encountering these particular biological weapons. The demographic collapse was so severe that some historians estimate the Taíno population declined by over 90% within 50 years of Spanish contact. Those Taíno who survived disease faced the grinding reality of encomienda labor, which turned their sophisticated agricultural system into forced production for Spanish markets. The sustainable conuco farming that had fed Jamaica for centuries was replaced by crops demanded by colonial administrators, disrupting both ecological balance and food security. It was environmental colonialism disguised as agricultural improvement, which is to say, ecological disaster with better marketing. Spanish colonial agriculture focused primarily on cassava, sweet potatoes and plantains for local consumption, along with small-scale production of crops that could be exported to other Spanish colonies. The Spanish also introduced European livestock, including cattle, pigs and horses, which had profound impacts on Jamaica's ecosystems. These animals, having evolved in entirely different environments, proceeded to reshape the island's landscape with the subtlety of bulldozers operated by teenagers. The introduction of cattle was particularly transformative, as these animals converted forest clearings into pasture land and established grazing patterns that would influence Jamaican agriculture for centuries. Pigs, meanwhile, demonstrated remarkable adaptability to tropical conditions and an impressive ability to disrupt indigenous farming systems, proving that ecological invasion doesn't require malicious intent, just different evolutionary strategies and unlimited appetite. Realizing that Sevilla la Nueva was essentially a mosquito-infested monument to poor urban planning, the Spanish moved their colonial capital to Villa de la Vega in 1524. This new settlement, later known as Spanish Town, was located in the more hospitable Liguanea Plain in the island's interior, where the elevation provided some relief from coastal humidity and disease vectors that had made the first capital feel like a tropical punishment. Villa de la Vega became the administrative centre of Spanish Jamaica, complete with a cathedral, government buildings, and the kind of central plaza that Spanish colonial planners installed with the consistency of a franchise operation. The town was laid out according to the laws of the Indies, Spanish regulations that mandated specific urban planning principles including grid street patterns, central squares, and strategic placement of religious and administrative buildings. The Spanish colonial economy in Jamaica never quite achieved the spectacular wealth that conquistadors had extracted from Mexico and Peru, largely because the island lacked significant gold deposits and the kind of indigenous empires whose accumulated treasures could be conveniently redistributed to Spanish coffers. Instead, Jamaica became what economists might politely call a developing market, and everyone else would recognize as a colonial backwater. Spanish Jamaica's primary economic activities included small-scale agriculture, cattle ranching, and serving as a supply station for Spanish fleets travelling between the Americas and Europe. The island produced enough to support its colonial population and contribute modestly to Spanish imperial revenues, but it never became the golden goose that Spanish administrators had hoped for when they first glimpsed its fertile valleys and abundant fresh water. The Spanish also established Jamaica's first sugar mills, introducing the crop that would later define the island's economy and social structure. However, 16th century sugar production in Jamaica remained relatively small-scale compared to the massive plantation systems that would develop under later British rule. Spanish sugar operations were more like agricultural experiments than the industrial-scale production that would transform the Caribbean economy in subsequent centuries. Spanish religious efforts in Jamaica centered around the Catholic Church's mission to convert indigenous populations, a spiritual project that operated alongside the considerably less spiritual project of extracting their labor. Franciscan and Dominican friars established missions throughout the island, building churches and attempting to replace Taíno religious practices with Catholic doctrine. This cultural conversion was about as successful as most attempts to completely transform someone else's worldview through a combination of persuasion and coercion. Some Taíno people adopted Catholic practices while maintaining their traditional beliefs, creating syncretic religious systems that combined indigenous and European elements. This cultural blending represented a form of resistance that preserved important aspects of Taíno spirituality within the framework imposed by colonial authorities, proving that religious conversion was rarely as complete or straightforward as missionaries claimed in their reports to European superiors. The Spanish period also saw the first African people brought to Jamaica as enslaved labourers, beginning a demographic transformation that would profoundly shape the island's future culture and society. Initially, the numbers were relatively small compared to the massive slave trade that would develop under British colonialism, but these early Africans began the process of cultural synthesis that would eventually create Jamaica's distinctive Afro-Caribbean identity. Spanish control of Jamaica faced persistent challenges from both internal resistance and external threats. Taíno people who survived the demographic collapse and labour exploitation retreated to Jamaica's mountainous interior, where the difficult terrain provided protection from Spanish authorities. Some joined with escaped African slaves to form the earliest maroon communities, establishing patterns of resistance that would continue throughout Jamaica's colonial period. The Spanish also had to defend Jamaica against increasingly frequent attacks by English, French, and Dutch pirates and privateers who found the island's strategic location and relatively weak defences irresistibly attractive. These raids disrupted Spanish shipping, captured valuable cargoes, and demonstrated that Spanish control of the Caribbean was considerably less secure than imperial maps suggested. Spanish fortification efforts in Jamaica included the construction of Fort Charles at Port Royal, though the early version was far less sophisticated than the massive fortress that would be built during the later British period. Spanish defensive strategies focused more on hiding wealth than fighting for it, reflecting the practical reality that Jamaica's colonial population was too small to mount effective resistance against determined attack. By the 1650s, Spanish Jamaica had developed into a modest colonial society that included Spanish settlers, mestizo populations, indigenous survivors, African slaves, and various combinations thereof. The social hierarchy was complex and often fluid, with racial categories that were more guidelines than rigid boundaries and social mobility that, while limited, was more possible than in many other colonial contexts. The Spanish colonial period in Jamaica lasted approximately 160 years, from 1510 to 1655. During this time, the island's indigenous population had been decimated, its ecosystems transformed by introduced species, and its economy integrated into the Spanish imperial system. However, Spanish Jamaica never achieved the wealth or strategic importance that would have guaranteed strong metropolitan support during moments of crisis. This relative weakness would prove decisive when English naval forces arrived in Jamaican waters in 1655, carrying invasion plans that would end Spanish rule and begin a new chapter in the island's colonial experience. The Spanish period had established colonial frameworks and begun demographic transformations that would influence Jamaica for centuries, but it had also demonstrated the vulnerability of colonial societies that lacked both strong indigenous foundations and committed imperial backing. As Spanish rule in Jamaica entered its final phase, the island remained a frontier society where European, indigenous, and African cultures were creating new forms of identity and resistance that would shape the coming centuries. The Spanish had introduced Christianity, European agricultural techniques, and colonial legal systems, but they had also created conditions that would eventually contribute to their own downfall and Jamaica's transformation into one of the most culturally dynamic societies in the Caribbean. Chapter 3: British Conquest and Plantation Society. In 1655, Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables arrived in Jamaican waters with 38 ships and approximately 7,000 English soldiers, sailors and colonists. Their mission was part of Oliver Cromwell's Western Design, an ambitious plan to seize Spanish territories in the Caribbean that sounded considerably more impressive on paper than it proved to be in practice. The fleet had already attempted to capture Hispaniola and failed spectacularly, making Jamaica something of a consolation prize, which is never the most flattering way to begin a colonial relationship. The English invasion force landed at Passage Fort near Spanish Town on May the 10th, 1655, meeting surprisingly little resistance from the Spanish garrison. This wasn't because the Spanish had suddenly developed pacifist tendencies, but rather because Governor Juan Ramirez de Arellano had approximately 150 soldiers to defend an entire island against 7,000 invaders. It was the kind of mathematical disadvantage that makes military strategists weep and surrender negotiations very brief. The Spanish evacuation was so hasty that many colonists fled to Cuba, leaving behind not only their possessions but also their slaves, who faced the choice between uncertain freedom under new masters or joining the growing maroon communities in Jamaica's mountainous interior. Many chose the mountains, swelling the ranks of escaped slaves who had been resisting Spanish authority for decades. These communities would become a persistent challenge for English colonial rule, proving that military conquest was considerably easier than social control. Before fleeing, the departing Spanish attempted to destroy anything that might be useful to their English replacements, including livestock, sugar mills, and food stores. This scorched earth strategy was about as effective as most desperate last-minute plans, which is to say it caused some inconvenience while failing to prevent the fundamental change of ownership. The English found enough infrastructure intact to begin establishing their own colonial administration, though they probably wished the Spanish had left better instructions for operating tropical sugar mills. The English initially struggled with their new Caribbean acquisition, largely because most of Cromwell's soldiers had signed up to fight other Europeans, not to establish tropical agricultural colonies. Disease rates were appalling, supplies were inadequate, and the climate was far less cooperative than English weather, which admittedly sets a remarkably low bar for meteorological hospitality. Within the first few years, thousands of English soldiers died from yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery, diseases that demonstrated nature's complete indifference to imperial ambitions. Despite these challenges, the English recognized Jamaica's potential for sugar production, a crop that was becoming increasingly valuable in European markets, as consumer demand for sweetness reached levels that would make modern nutritionists profoundly concerned. Sugar had the commercial advantage of being both highly profitable and completely addictive, which made it the ideal colonial commodity for societies that hadn't yet invented more sophisticated methods of economic dependency. The transformation of Jamaica into a sugar colony required massive imports of enslaved African labour, as the indigenous Taíno population had been decimated during Spanish rule and English indentured servants proved both expensive and unsuited to tropical agricultural work. The English had already developed extensive experience with the slave trade in Barbados and other Caribbean colonies, so they approached Jamaica's labour needs with the kind of systematic brutality that characterised successful colonial enterprises. The Royal African Company, established in 1660, held the monopoly on supplying enslaved Africans to English colonies until 1698, when the trade was opened to independent merchants. This change dramatically increased the volume of slave ships arriving in Jamaica, transforming the island's demographic composition and establishing the foundation for a plantation society based on racial exploitation that would define Jamaica for the next 2 centuries. Enslaved Africans brought to Jamaica came from various regions of West and Central Africa, including Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and Central Africa. This diversity meant that Jamaican slave communities included people speaking dozens of different languages, practicing varied religious traditions, and bringing sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, and other technologies that proved invaluable for colonial development. The Middle Passage to Jamaica was particularly brutal, with mortality rates that often exceeded 20% during the ocean crossing. Ships arriving at Port Royal and Kingston harboured brought human cargo that had survived weeks or months of conditions so horrific that even contemporary observers, who weren't notably sensitive about human suffering, described them as unconscionable. The survivors faced the additional trauma of slave markets where families were separated and individuals were sold like livestock to plantation owners who evaluated their purchase based on physical strength and perceived docility. English sugar plantations in Jamaica operated as total institutions that controlled every aspect of enslaved people's lives, from work schedules and living conditions to religious practices and family relationships. The plantation system was designed to maximize sugar production while minimizing labor costs, which meant treating human beings as agricultural machinery that could be worked until it broke and then replaced more cheaply than repaired. The typical Jamaican sugar plantation included extensive cane fields, a sugar mill powered by water or wind, boiling houses where cane juice was processed into raw sugar, distilleries for producing rum, and slave quarters that provided minimal shelter for the workforce. The Great House, where plantation owners and their families lived, was usually positioned to overlook the entire operation, providing both practical supervision and symbolic demonstration of the social hierarchy that defined plantation society. Sugar production was labor-intensive and dangerous work that required enslaved people to plant, cultivate, harvest, and process sugar cane under conditions that were often lethal. The harvest season, which ran from January to June, demanded 18-hour workdays in tropical heat, while the processing of cane juice required workers to tend boiling vats of sugar syrup that could cause horrific burns. It was industrial agriculture before the invention of industrial safety regulations, which made sugar production approximately as hazardous as it sounds. Plantation owners divided enslaved workers into different categories based on their assigned roles within the sugar production system. Field slaves formed the largest group, working in gangs under the supervision of drivers who were often enslaved people themselves, trusted with authority that came with both privileges and the impossible burden of enforcing a system designed to exploit their own communities. House slaves worked in plantation residences, often developing closer relationships with white families that provided certain advantages while exposing them to different forms of abuse and psychological manipulation. Skilled slaves included carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, coopers, and other craftsmen whose expertise was essential for plantation operations. These individuals often enjoyed greater autonomy and better living conditions, and some were able to earn money through hiring out their services to other plantation owners. However, their relative privileges existed entirely at the discretion of their owners and could be revoked at any time, making their elevated status both valuable and precarious. The plantation system also relied on enslaved women's reproductive labour, as natural increase helped maintain the workforce while reducing the costs of importing new slaves from Africa. However, the brutal working conditions meant that infant and maternal mortality rates were extremely high, and many enslaved women used various methods to prevent pregnancy or end pregnancies, rather than bring children into slavery. This reproductive resistance represented one form of defiance against a system that sought to control every aspect of human existence. English colonial law in Jamaica codified the dehumanization of enslaved people through comprehensive slave codes that defined African-descended people as property rather than persons. These laws prohibited slaves from carrying weapons, traveling without passes, gathering in groups, or practicing traditional religions. The codes also established brutal punishments for resistance, including whipping, branding, and execution, while providing legal protections for masters who killed or injured their slaves during the course of reasonable punishment. Despite these legal restrictions, enslaved people in Jamaica developed vibrant communities and cultural practices that preserved African traditions while adapting to Caribbean conditions. They created new languages, religious systems, musical forms, and social institutions that provided both psychological survival mechanisms and foundations for resistance against the plantation system. These cultural innovations represented remarkable human creativity, flourishing under the most oppressive circumstances imaginable. The economic success of Jamaican sugar plantations made the island one of the most valuable colonies in the British Empire by the early 18th century. Sugar exports generated enormous profits that flowed to plantation owners, merchants, and investors in Britain, while the associated trade in slaves, rum, and manufactured goods created complex commercial networks that connected Jamaica to markets throughout the Atlantic world. Port Royal, located on a narrow spit of land protecting Kingston Harbour, became one of the most important commercial centres in the Caribbean during the early English period. The port served not only legitimate merchants but also pirates and privateers who used Jamaica as a base for attacking Spanish shipping throughout the region. This semi-legal piracy was initially encouraged by English colonial authorities, who saw it as a cost-effective method of weakening Spanish power while generating revenue through the sale of captured goods. The most famous of these Caribbean pirates was Henry Morgan, who operated from Port Royal during the 1660s and 70s, launching devastating attacks against Spanish settlements throughout Central America and the Caribbean. Morgan's raids generated enormous wealth for both himself and the English colonial government, which received a percentage of all captured treasure. His success demonstrated that piracy could be extremely profitable when conducted with government approval and military organisation. However, Port Royal's golden age as a pirate haven ended abruptly on June 7th, 1692, when a massive earthquake struck the city. The disaster, which contemporary observers described as divine punishment for the port's wicked ways, caused much of the city to slide into Kingston Harbour, killing approximately 2,000 people and destroying most of the buildings that had made Port Royal the richest and wickedest city in the world. The destruction of Port Royal led to the development of Kingston as Jamaica's primary commercial centre. Kingston, located on the north shore of Kingston Harbour, offered better protection from natural disasters and more space for expansion than the narrow peninsula that had supported Port Royal. The new city quickly became the hub of Jamaica's sugar trade and the centre of the island's growing commercial economy. Meanwhile, in Jamaica's mountainous interior, maroon communities continued to expand as more enslaved people escaped from plantations and joined established settlements in the Blue Mountains, Cockpit Country, and other areas where difficult terrain provided protection from colonial authorities. These communities developed sophisticated military organizations and sustainable economies that allowed them to maintain their independence for decades while providing refuge for plantation escapees. The most famous maroon leader was Cudjoe, who organized communities in the western parishes and led successful resistance campaigns against English colonial forces during the 1720s and 30s. Cudjoe's warriors used guerrilla tactics perfectly adapted to Jamaica's mountainous terrain. ambushing English patrols and disappearing into forests that they knew intimately, while their pursuers stumbled through unfamiliar and often impassable landscape. English colonial authorities eventually recognized that military campaigns against the Maroons were both expensive and ineffective, leading to the negotiation of peace treaties in 1739 that granted the Maroon communities legal autonomy in exchange for agreements to stop accepting new runaway slaves and to assist in capturing future escapees. These treaties represented a remarkable achievement for communities of former slaves who had successfully fought the English Empire to a standstill and negotiated recognition of their independence. By the mid-18th century, Jamaica had been transformed into a classic plantation society where a small number of wealthy English planters controlled vast estates worked by tens of thousands of enslaved Africans. The island's economy was almost entirely dependent on sugar production and export, making it vulnerable to fluctuations in European markets and changes in international trade policies. This economic specialization generated enormous wealth for plantation owners and British merchants, while creating a society built on systematic exploitation and racial oppression. The social hierarchy of plantation Jamaica was rigidly stratified by race and legal status, with white plantation owners and colonial officials at the top, free people of colour forming a small middle group, and enslaved Africans comprising the vast majority of the population. However, this apparently simple structure concealed considerable complexity, as the categories of race and freedom were more fluid than colonial law suggested, and individuals could sometimes change their status through various legal, economic, or personal arrangements. The plantation system also produced environmental changes that transformed Jamaica's landscape and ecosystems. Extensive deforestation cleared land for sugar cultivation, while intensive agriculture depleted soil fertility and increased erosion. The introduction of new plant and animal species continued to alter the island's biodiversity, creating new ecological relationships that would influence Jamaica's environmental development for centuries to come. As the 18th century progressed, the contradictions within Jamaica's plantation society became increasingly apparent. The enormous wealth generated by sugar production coexisted with brutal exploitation. Cultural creativity flourished alongside systematic oppression, and communities built strong social bonds while living under constant threat of violence. These tensions would eventually contribute to the resistance movements and social changes that would challenge and ultimately transform the plantation system that had defined Jamaica for over a century. Chapter 4: Resistance and Road to Freedom. The peace treaties of 1739 that granted autonomy to Jamaica's Maroon communities represented more than diplomatic agreements. They were formal recognition that enslaved people could successfully resist colonial authority and negotiate their own freedom. However, these treaties also created new tensions within Jamaican society, as the Maroons agreed to help capture future runaway slaves in exchange for their own independence, essentially becoming part of the system that maintained plantation slavery while remaining outside its direct control. This complicated arrangement worked relatively well for several decades, but began to unravel in the 1770s when a new generation of Maroon leaders questioned the wisdom of collaborating with colonial authorities. The spark that ignited the Second Maroon War came in 1795, when colonial officials demanded that a Maroon leader named Cudjoe's nephew be handed over for punishment after an incident involving the theft of some pigs, which proves that major historical conflicts can begin with surprisingly mundane disputes about livestock. The Trelawney Town Maroons, led by a chief named Accompong, refused to surrender their people to colonial justice. arguing that the treaties guaranteed their internal autonomy. Colonial authorities disagreed, leading to a conflict that would demonstrate both the continued strength of Maroon military organisation and the growing sophistication of British colonial military tactics. The war lasted for 5 months and required the colonial government to import professional soldiers and tracking dogs from Cuba to finally suppress the rebellion. The use of Cuban bloodhounds in the Second Maroon War marked a particularly grim escalation in colonial military tactics. These dogs were specifically trained to track and attack human beings, representing a level of dehumanization that shocked even contemporary observers who were generally comfortable with the brutalities of plantation slavery. The psychological impact of the dogs was as important as their practical effectiveness, creating terror that extended far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Despite their eventual military defeat, the Trelawney Maroons negotiated surprisingly favourable surrender terms that allowed most to remain in Jamaica rather than face deportation. However, colonial authorities violated these agreements and transported over 600 Maroons to Nova Scotia in 1796, where they spent several miserable years in a climate that was spectacularly unsuited to people accustomed to tropical conditions. The Nova Scotia experiment was such an obvious failure that the British eventually relocated the exiled Maroons to Sierra Leone in West Africa, completing a forced migration that took them literally around the world. While Maroon resistance dominated headlines in the 1790s, enslaved people on plantations throughout Jamaica were developing their own forms of organised resistance that would prove even more threatening to the colonial system. The successful slave revolution in Haiti, which began in 1791 and achieved independence in 1804, provided both inspiration and practical lessons for enslaved people throughout the Caribbean who were watching their neighbours overthrow the most brutal plantation system in the Americas. News of Haitian independence spread through Jamaica's slave communities despite colonial authorities' attempts to suppress information about the revolution. Enslaved people had their own communication networks that operated through markets, religious gatherings, and work relationships, creating what historians now recognize as remarkably sophisticated intelligence systems that kept plantation communities informed about events throughout the Caribbean and beyond. The first major plantation uprising inspired by the Haitian example occurred in 1831 and was led by Samuel Sharp, a Baptist deacon and enslaved person who had developed a following among slaves in western Jamaica. Sharp's rebellion began as a general strike intended to force improvements in working conditions, but escalated into armed resistance when plantation owners and colonial authorities responded with violence rather than negotiation. Samuel Sharp was an extraordinary individual who demonstrated that enslaved people were perfectly capable of sophisticated political analysis and strategic planning when given the opportunity to develop their talents. He was literate, charismatic, and deeply religious, using his position as a Baptist preacher to organize resistance while maintaining the appearance of compliance with colonial authority. His ability to inspire and coordinate action across multiple plantations revealed organizational capabilities that colonial officials had consistently underestimated. The rebellion that became known as the Baptist War, or Christmas Rebellion, began on December 27, 1831, when enslaved people on plantations throughout western Jamaica stopped working and demanded better treatment. When plantation owners attempted to force them back to work through violence, the strike transformed into armed resistance that spread across multiple parishes and involved tens of thousands of enslaved people. The scale and coordination of the rebellion shocked colonial authorities, who had convinced themselves that enslaved people lacked the intelligence and organization necessary for large-scale resistance. The reality was that plantation communities had been developing resistance networks for decades, using religious meetings, market gatherings, and family connections to create communication systems that allowed coordinated action across vast distances. Colonial military response to the rebellion was swift and brutal, involving regular British troops, local militia, and Maroon auxiliaries who honoured their treaty obligations to assist in suppressing slave uprisings. The fighting lasted for several weeks and resulted in the deaths of approximately 200 enslaved people and 14 white colonists, casualty figures that reflected both the determination of the rebels and the overwhelming military advantages enjoyed by colonial forces. Samuel Sharp was captured in January 1832 and executed along with hundreds of other rebellion participants. Before his death, he reportedly stated that he would rather die free than live as a slave, words that encapsulated the fundamental challenge that resistance movements posed to the philosophical foundations of plantation society. His execution made him a martyr whose memory would inspire future generations of freedom fighters. The Baptist War had consequences that extended far beyond Jamaica's borders, providing crucial evidence for British abolitionists who were arguing that slavery was both morally wrong and practically unsustainable. The rebellion demonstrated that enslaved people would continue to resist their bondage regardless of the costs, making the plantation system increasingly expensive and dangerous to maintain. This practical argument proved more persuasive to British politicians than purely moral objections to slavery. The growing influence of evangelical Christianity among both enslaved people and British reformers created new challenges for the plantation system. Baptist and Methodist missionaries have been active in Jamaica since the late 18th century, preaching a gospel of spiritual equality that was difficult to reconcile with racial slavery. When colonial authorities attempted to blame Baptist missionaries for inspiring the rebellion, they inadvertently created a religious freedom issue that resonated with British public opinion. Meanwhile, economic changes in Britain were reducing the profitability of West Indian sugar production and making the plantation system less crucial to British economic interests. The development of sugar beet production in Europe provided alternative sources of sweetness that didn't require tropical slave labour, while industrial development was creating new forms of wealth that made Caribbean plantation profits seem increasingly marginal. The combination of moral opposition, practical resistance, and economic change created political momentum for abolition that culminated in the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act by the British Parliament in 1833. This legislation mandated the gradual elimination of slavery throughout the British Empire, though the transition period was designed to protect the economic interests of plantation owners rather than prioritise the welfare of enslaved people. The abolition process in Jamaica began with the implementation of an apprenticeship system in 1834 that was supposed to prepare enslaved people for freedom while providing plantation owners with continued access to their labour. In practice, apprenticeship was slavery under a different name, requiring former slaves to work without wages for their former masters for 6 years while ostensibly learning the skills necessary for independent life. The apprenticeship system was such an obvious fraud that even British colonial administrators found it difficult to implement with straight faces. Former slaves were required to work for 40.5 hours per week without compensation, could be punished for disobedience, and were prohibited from leaving plantation property without permission. The only significant difference from slavery was that apprentices could theoretically purchase their freedom early and had limited legal rights that were honoured more in theory than practice. Resistance to the apprenticeship system was immediate and sustained, with former slaves using work slowdowns, legal challenges, and political pressure to expose the system's fundamental injustice. British abolitionists, who had been caught off guard by the gradual nature of emancipation, organised campaigns to end apprenticeship early and achieve full freedom for Caribbean workers. The apprenticeship system was so clearly unsustainable that it was abandoned in 1838, 2 years earlier than originally planned. On August 1st, 1838, approximately 300,000 enslaved people in Jamaica achieved legal freedom, ending over 3 centuries of racial slavery on the island. The date became known as Emancipation Day and remains one of the most important holidays in Jamaican history. However, legal freedom did not immediately translate into economic independence or social equality for Jamaica's newly freed population. Plantation owners retained control of the land, capital, and political power that determined economic opportunities, while former slaves faced deliberate efforts to maintain their dependence on plantation labor through various legal and economic restrictions. Many plantation owners attempted to continue exploiting their former slaves by offering wages so low that workers would remain trapped in poverty and dependence. Others imported indentured laborers from India and China to replace freed slaves who refused to accept subsistence wages for plantation work. These immigration programs created new forms of ethnic diversity in Jamaica, while demonstrating plantation owners' determination to maintain cheap labor regardless of its source. Former slaves responded to these challenges by developing alternative economic strategies that reduced their dependence on plantation employment. Many established small farms on marginal lands, growing crops for local markets and subsistence consumption. Others moved to towns and cities, seeking employment in trades, domestic service, and small businesses that provided alternatives to plantation labor. The development of a free peasant economy represented one of the most significant achievements of post-emancipation Jamaica. Former slaves used their knowledge of tropical agriculture to establish productive farms that supplied food crops to local markets, while providing economic independence for thousands of families. This peasant agriculture was more sustainable and environmentally sound than plantation monoculture, demonstrating alternative approaches to Caribbean economic development. Religious freedom expanded dramatically after emancipation, as former slaves were no longer restricted in their worship practices and could openly participate in the Baptist, Methodist, and other Christian denominations that had provided spiritual sustenance during the slavery period. The growth of independent churches led by black ministers created new centers of community leadership and social organization that would play crucial roles in Jamaica's future political development. Education also became a priority for Jamaica's freed population, who recognized that literacy and learning were essential tools for achieving genuine equality. Missionary societies established schools throughout the island, while many families made enormous sacrifices to ensure their children could attend classes and acquire the knowledge that had been deliberately denied during slavery. The period immediately following emancipation was marked by significant demographic changes as former slaves exercised their new freedom of movement. Many left the plantations where they had been enslaved, seeking opportunities in different parishes or establishing new communities in previously unsettled areas. This internal migration reflected both the desire to escape the psychological associations of former bondage and practical calculations about where economic opportunities might be most promising. Political representation remained severely limited for Jamaica's black population, as voting rights were restricted to property owners and the educated elite. However, the expansion of education and economic opportunities gradually increased the number of people eligible to participate in political processes, creating the foundation for future civil rights movements and independence struggles. The legacy of resistance movements from the Maroon Wars through emancipation established patterns of organized opposition to racial oppression that would influence Jamaican politics for generations. The successful examples of Samuel Sharp, the Maroon leaders, and countless unnamed individuals who chose freedom over security provided inspiration for future movements that would challenge colonialism, racism, and economic exploitation. By 1850, Jamaica had been transformed from a slave society into a post-emancipation colony where former slaves, indentured immigrants, and mixed-race populations were creating new forms of Caribbean culture and society. The plantation system continued to exist but no longer dominated the island's economy or social structure to the extent it had during the slavery period. The road to freedom had been long and difficult, but it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of Jamaican history and created possibilities for development that would have been impossible under the constraints of racial bondage. Chapter 5: Independence Struggle and Modern Jamaica. The aftermath of emancipation created political challenges that the existing colonial government was spectacularly unprepared to handle, largely because it had been designed to manage a plantation slave society rather than a diverse democracy with competing economic interests. The Jamaican Assembly, which had governed the colony since the 17th century, was dominated by white planters who had little interest in representing the newly freed population that now constituted the vast majority of island residents. Political tensions reached a breaking point in 1865 during what became known as the Morant Bay Rebellion, an uprising that began with a protest against unfair taxation and escalated into a broader challenge to colonial authority. The rebellion was led by Paul Bogle, a Baptist deacon and small farmer who had organised his community to demand political representation and economic justice through peaceful means before concluding that more direct action was necessary. The immediate cause of the rebellion was a dispute over taxation and land tenure, but the underlying issues included the systematic exclusion of black Jamaicans from political participation and economic opportunity. The colonial government's response was swift and disproportionate, involving the declaration of martial law and military action that resulted in over 400 deaths, mostly among black protesters who had been demanding basic civil rights. Paul Bogle and George William Gordon, a mixed-race politician who had supported the protesters' cause, were executed without proper trials, making them martyrs for the cause of Jamaican self-governance. Their deaths sparked outrage both in Jamaica and Britain, where critics argued that colonial authorities had used excessive force against people whose primary crime was demanding representation in their own government. The Morant Bay Rebellion convinced British authorities that Jamaica's existing political system was fundamentally unsustainable, leading to the abolition of the Colonial Assembly in 1866 and the establishment of Crown Colony government. This change eliminated the pretense of local self-governance and placed Jamaica under direct British administrative control, a system that would last for nearly a century and profoundly shape the island's political development. Crown Colony government brought certain advantages, including more professional administration and reduced influence of the planter elite who had dominated the assembly system. However, it also meant that Jamaicans had even less control over their own affairs than before, with major decisions being made by appointed British officials who were accountable to London rather than to the people they governed. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw significant economic and social changes in Jamaica as the island adapted to its new political status and the continuing transformation of Caribbean society. The completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 created new shipping routes that affected Jamaica's trade patterns, while technological innovations like refrigerated transport opened new markets for Jamaican agricultural products. The development of the banana industry became particularly important during this period, as United States companies established large-scale plantations and shipping operations that made bananas Jamaica's leading export crop for several decades. The Boston Fruit Company, which later became part of the United Fruit Company, built extensive rail networks and port facilities that connected previously isolated areas of the island to international markets. However, the banana industry also demonstrated the continuing challenges of economic dependence on foreign-controlled export agriculture. Disease outbreaks, particularly Panama disease, periodically devastated banana plantations, while changes in international markets and shipping costs could dramatically affect the profitability of Jamaican exports. The island remained vulnerable to economic forces beyond its control, a pattern that would continue throughout the colonial period. The early 20th century also witnessed the emergence of new forms of political consciousness among Jamaica's population, influenced by global movements for civil rights, anti-colonialism, and black nationalism. Marcus Garvey, born in St. Ann's Bay in 1887, became one of the most influential figures in the global black freedom movement, advocating for African unity, economic independence, and racial pride that challenged colonial assumptions about racial hierarchy. Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded in 1914, promoted the idea that people of African descent around the world should unite to establish independent nations and economic institutions. While his specific proposals for African colonization proved impractical, his broader message of black self-determination and racial pride influenced independence movements throughout Africa and the Caribbean for decades to come. The economic difficulties of the Great Depression in the 1930s created new pressures on Jamaica's colonial economy and social system. Unemployment rose dramatically as international demand for agricultural exports declined, while the colonial government lacked both the resources and the political will to address the resulting social problems. These conditions created fertile ground for labour organising and political activism that would transform Jamaican politics. Labour unrest erupted across the Caribbean during the 1930s, with Jamaica experiencing particularly significant strikes and protests in 1938. These disturbances, led by figures like Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley, demonstrated the growing political sophistication of working-class Jamaicans and their determination to achieve better economic conditions and political representation. Alexander Bustamante, a charismatic labour leader who had spent years working in various occupations throughout the Americas, organised dock workers and agricultural labourers into effective unions that could negotiate with employers and government authorities. His Jamaica Labour Party, founded in 1943, became one of the island's two major political organisations and played a crucial role in the independence movement. Norman Manley, a successful lawyer and intellectual who represented a different political tradition than Bustamante, founded the People's National Party in 1938 with a platform that emphasized democratic socialism, economic planning, and gradual movement toward independence. The rivalry between Manley and Bustamante, both personal and political, would define Jamaican politics for several decades and establish the two-party system that continues to dominate the island's political life. World War II brought significant changes to Jamaica's economy and society, as the island served as a crucial base for Allied operations in the Caribbean. The construction of military facilities provided employment for thousands of Jamaicans, while the war effort created demand for bauxite, a mineral that Jamaica possessed in abundance and that would become crucial for the island's post-war economic development. The discovery and exploitation of Jamaica's bauxite deposits represented a major shift in the island's economic structure, moving beyond dependence on agricultural exports to include mining of raw materials for industrial production. However, bauxite mining was capital-intensive and controlled by foreign corporations, meaning that most of the profits flowed out of Jamaica while the environmental costs remained on the island. The post-war period saw accelerating demands for political independence throughout the British Empire, as colonized peoples drew inspiration from the defeat of fascism and applied its lessons to their own struggles against imperial domination. In Jamaica, both major political parties supported eventual independence, though they disagreed about the timing and the economic policies that should accompany political freedom. The British government, facing the enormous costs of post-war reconstruction and the collapse of its global empire, was increasingly willing to grant independence to Caribbean colonies that could demonstrate political stability and economic viability. The challenge for Jamaican leaders was to create institutions and policies that could manage independence successfully while addressing the social and economic problems inherited from centuries of colonial rule. Constitutional reforms in 1944 established universal adult suffrage in Jamaica, allowing all citizens over 21 to vote, regardless of property ownership or literacy requirements. This expansion of democratic participation fundamentally altered Jamaican politics by giving voice to working class and peasant populations who had been excluded from political power throughout the colonial period. The introduction of universal suffrage led to the first truly democratic elections in Jamaican history, with both major parties competing for votes from across the social spectrum rather than just appealing to property-owning elites. The Jamaica Labour Party won the first election under the new system, but political competition remained intense and would continue to drive policy debates throughout the independence period. Efforts to create a West Indian Federation during the 1950s represented an attempt to achieve independence through regional cooperation rather than individual island autonomy. The Federation, which included Jamaica and 9 other British Caribbean territories, was designed to create a larger, more economically viable political unit that could negotiate more effectively with international partners and coordinate regional development policies. However, the West Indian Federation faced numerous practical and political challenges, including disagreements about the location of the federal capital, the distribution of costs and benefits among member territories, and the extent of federal versus local authority. Jamaica's political leaders, particularly Norman Manley, initially supported federation but faced growing opposition from voters who feared that Jamaica would subsidize less developed territories without receiving proportional benefits. The federation effectively collapsed in 1961, when Jamaica voted to withdraw following a referendum campaign that revealed deep skepticism about regional integration among the Jamaican electorate. The failure of federation meant that Jamaica would pursue independence as an individual nation rather than as part of a Caribbean confederation, a decision that had profound implications for the island's subsequent political and economic development. Alexander Bustamante led Jamaica to independence on August 6, 1962, becoming the island's first prime minister under a Westminster-style parliamentary system that retained Queen Elizabeth II as head of state, while transferring effective political control to elected Jamaican officials. Independence Day celebrations reflected both pride in achieving self-governance and uncertainty about the challenges that lay ahead for the new nation. The early years of independence were marked by economic optimism and rapid social change, as Jamaica attempted to build modern institutions while maintaining political stability and economic growth. The government invested heavily in education, healthcare, and infrastructure development, using revenues from bauxite mining and tourism to fund ambitious modernization programs that aimed to transform Jamaica into a developed Caribbean nation. Education became a particular priority for the independent government, which recognized that developing human capital was essential for economic diversification and social mobility. The expansion of secondary education and the establishment of the University of the West Indies campus at Mona provided opportunities for advanced learning that had been extremely limited during the colonial period. Tourism emerged as another important economic sector during the independence period, as Jamaica's natural beauty, cultural attractions, and political stability made it an appealing destination for North American and European visitors. The development of resort areas like Montego Bay and Negril created employment opportunities while generating foreign exchange earnings that helped finance other development projects. However, the benefits of economic growth were unevenly distributed, with significant portions of Jamaica's population continuing to face poverty, unemployment, and limited access to education and healthcare. These inequalities created social tensions that would influence Jamaican politics throughout the independence period and contribute to periodic outbreaks of violence and political instability. The emergence of Rastafarianism during the 1930s and its continued growth during the independence period represented a uniquely Jamaican response to the challenges of post-colonial identity formation. Drawing inspiration from Marcus Garvey's teachings about African heritage and divine purpose, Rastafarian communities developed spiritual practices, social customs, and cultural expressions that celebrated black consciousness, while critiquing the materialism and inequality of modern society. Reggae music, which emerged from Jamaica's urban communities during the 1960s, provided a powerful vehicle for expressing social commentary, spiritual beliefs, and cultural pride that resonated far beyond the island's borders. Artists like Bob Marley, Jimmy Cliff, and countless others used reggae to communicate messages about social justice, spiritual awakening, and Caribbean identity that influenced global popular culture and political movements. By 1975, Jamaica had established itself as an independent nation with a functioning democratic government, a diversified economy, and a distinctive cultural identity that combined African, European, and indigenous influences in creative ways. However, the island also faced continuing challenges related to economic dependence, social inequality, and the legacy of centuries of colonial exploitation that would require ongoing attention from future generations of Jamaican leaders and citizens. Chapter 6: Contemporary Jamaica and Geographic Wonders. Modern Jamaica stands as one of the Caribbean's most culturally influential nations, a distinction that becomes even more remarkable when you consider that the island's population of approximately 2.9 million people has produced artistic, athletic, and intellectual contributions that reach every corner of the globe. From the Blue Mountains to the coral reefs, from reggae studios to Olympic training facilities, contemporary Jamaica represents a fascinating synthesis of natural beauty, cultural creativity, and human resilience. The island's geography continues to shape both its challenges and opportunities in the 21st century. Jamaica's location in the hurricane belt means that tropical storms remain a persistent concern, requiring sophisticated disaster preparedness systems and resilient infrastructure that can withstand nature's occasional tantrums. Climate change has added new dimensions to these challenges, with rising sea levels threatening coastal communities and changing rainfall patterns affecting agriculture in ways that would make ancient Taíno farmers shake their heads in recognition. The Blue Mountains, which rise majestically from Jamaica's eastern parishes to heights exceeding 7,000 feet, remain one of the island's most spectacular geographic features and economic assets. These peaks, often shrouded in mists that create perfect growing conditions for coffee, produce some of the world's most expensive and sought-after coffee beans. Blue Mountain coffee has achieved the kind of international recognition that makes coffee snobs weep with joy and casual drinkers check their bank account balance before ordering. The coffee industry in the Blue Mountains represents a remarkable example of geographic specificity creating economic value. The combination of altitude, rainfall, soil composition, and temperature creates growing conditions that cannot be replicated elsewhere, making authentic Blue Mountain coffee literally irreplaceable. This geographic monopoly has enabled Jamaican coffee farmers to command premium prices while maintaining traditional cultivation methods that prioritize quality over quantity. Jamaica's coral reefs and marine ecosystems represent another dimension of the island's natural wealth, supporting both tourism and fishing industries that employ thousands of people while providing crucial environmental services. The coral reefs that fringe much of Jamaica's coastline create spectacular underwater landscapes that attract divers and snorkelers from around the world, while also providing natural barriers against coastal erosion and storm damage. However, these marine ecosystems face significant threats from pollution, overfishing, and climate change that have caused coral bleaching and ecosystem degradation in recent decades. Conservation efforts, including the establishment of marine protected areas and sustainable fishing practices, represent ongoing attempts to balance economic development with environmental preservation, a challenge that requires the kind of long-term thinking that modern political systems sometimes struggle to maintain. The tourism industry has become one of Jamaica's most important economic sectors, generating billions of dollars in revenue annually and employing hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly. The island's appeal to international visitors combines natural beauty with cultural attractions, from pristine beaches and mountain landscapes to historic sites and vibrant music scenes that offer experiences unavailable elsewhere in the Caribbean. Montego Bay, Jamaica's tourism capital, exemplifies both the benefits and challenges of mass tourism development. The city's airport welcomes millions of visitors annually, while resort complexes along the coast provide employment for local residents and generate foreign exchange earnings that support the national economy. However, the concentration of tourism in relatively small geographic areas has created development pressures that sometimes conflict with environmental protection and community interests. Negril, at Jamaica's western tip, offers a different model of tourism development that emphasizes the island's natural attractions and laid-back cultural atmosphere. 7 Mile Beach, despite being closer to 4 miles long, which suggests either optimistic marketing or creative measurement techniques, provides one of the Caribbean's most beautiful stretches of white sand and clear water, attracting visitors who prefer spectacular sunsets to organized resort activities. The economic impact of tourism extends far beyond the immediate hospitality sector, supporting agriculture through demand for local food products, crafts industries that produce souvenirs and artistic works, and transportation networks that connect tourist areas with the rest of the island. This multiplier effect makes tourism a particularly important economic driver for a developing nation seeking to diversify its economy and reduce dependence on traditional export commodities. Jamaica's bauxite and alumina industry continues to play a significant role in the national economy, despite fluctuations in global aluminum markets and competition from other producing countries. The island possesses some of the world's highest quality bauxite deposits, containing the aluminum ore that is essential for producing everything from aircraft to beverage cans. However, bauxite mining has environmental costs, including land degradation and dust pollution, that require ongoing management and remediation efforts. The agricultural sector, while less dominant than during the colonial period, remains important for both export earnings and domestic food security. Jamaica's diverse climate zones enable the production of everything from tropical fruits and spices to temperate crops grown in higher elevations. The island exports significant quantities of sugar, bananas, coffee, and specialty crops like ackee and breadfruit that have found markets among Caribbean diaspora communities worldwide. Modern Jamaican agriculture faces challenges from climate change, international competition, and the need to balance export production with food security for the domestic population. Small-scale farming continues to provide livelihoods for thousands of families while supplying local markets with fresh produce, maintaining agricultural traditions that connect contemporary Jamaica with its pre-Columbian and post-emancipation heritage. The cultural industries have emerged as another significant economic sector, with reggae music, film production, fashion, and other creative enterprises generating both revenue and international recognition for Jamaica. The global popularity of reggae, dancehall, and other Jamaican musical forms has created opportunities for musicians, producers, sound engineers, and associated businesses that extend the island's cultural influence far beyond its geographic boundaries. Bob Marley's legacy continues to attract visitors to Jamaica decades after his death, with the Bob Marley Museum in Kingston and various sites associated with his life and career becoming pilgrimage destinations for reggae fans worldwide. This cultural tourism demonstrates how artistic creativity can become economic assets that generate long-term benefits for local communities while preserving and celebrating cultural heritage. Jamaican athletics, particularly in track and field, has achieved international prominence that seems almost impossible given the island's small population. The emergence of sprinting legends like Usain Bolt, Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce, and many others has made Jamaica synonymous with speed and athletic excellence, inspiring young athletes worldwide while generating national pride that transcends sports. The success of Jamaican athletes reflects both natural talent and sophisticated training systems that have developed around institutions like the University of Technology and various high school athletic programs. The island's climate allows for year-round outdoor training, while the competitive culture of school athletics provides early identification and development of promising athletes who might otherwise never discover their abilities. Kingston, Jamaica's capital and largest city, exemplifies both the opportunities and challenges of contemporary Caribbean urban development. The metropolitan area houses over 1 million people, making it one of the largest urban concentrations in the English-speaking Caribbean. The city serves as the island's political, economic, and cultural centre, hosting government offices, major businesses, universities, and cultural institutions that define much of Jamaica's national life. However, Kingston also faces significant urban challenges, including poverty, crime, and infrastructure strain that reflect broader development issues affecting many Caribbean nations. Efforts to address these problems include urban renewal projects, improved public transportation, and community development programs that aim to create more equitable access to economic opportunities and social services. The Jamaican diaspora, numbering in the millions worldwide, maintains strong connections with the island through family relationships, cultural practices, and economic remittances that provide crucial support for many Jamaican families. Caribbean communities in New York, London, Toronto, and other major cities serve as cultural ambassadors while creating economic opportunities through trade, investment, and tourism promotion that benefit both their host countries and Jamaica itself. Contemporary Jamaica faces environmental challenges that require innovative solutions and international cooperation. Deforestation, primarily driven by agricultural expansion and charcoal production, threatens the island's remaining forest ecosystems and contributes to soil erosion and watershed degradation. Climate change adds urgency to these concerns, with projections suggesting increased drought, more intense hurricanes, and sea level rise that could affect agriculture, tourism, and coastal communities. Conservation efforts include reforestation programs, protected area management, and sustainable development initiatives that attempt to balance economic needs with environmental protection. The Blue and John Crow Mountains National Park, designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, represents one example of efforts to preserve Jamaica's natural heritage while supporting ecotourism and scientific research that contribute to global understanding of tropical mountain ecosystems. The political system that emerged from independence continues to function as a Westminster-style parliamentary democracy, with peaceful transfers of power between the Jamaica Labour Party and People's National Party that demonstrate the stability of Jamaican democratic institutions. However, political competition sometimes becomes intense, reflecting deep social divisions and competing visions for the island's future development that require ongoing dialogue and compromise. Education remains a national priority, with Jamaica achieving high literacy rates and expanding access to higher education through institutions like the University of the West Indies, the University of Technology, and various community colleges. The emphasis on education reflects recognition that human capital development is essential for economic diversification and competitiveness in global markets that increasingly reward knowledge and innovation. Jamaica's geographic position continues to influence its economic and political relationships, serving as a bridge between North and South America while maintaining close ties with Caribbean neighbours and the broader international community. The island's membership in organisations like CARICOM, the Organization of American States, and the United Nations reflects its commitment to regional cooperation and multilateral diplomacy that helps small nations navigate complex global challenges. The natural beauty that first attracted Taíno settlers, Spanish explorers, and British colonists continues to inspire contemporary Jamaicans and international visitors who find in the island's landscapes a combination of tropical splendour and cultural richness that seems almost too good to be true. From the misty peaks of the Blue Mountains to the crystal-clear waters of the Caribbean Sea, from bustling urban markets to tranquil rural villages, Jamaica offers geographic diversity that provides something for every taste and temperament. As Jamaica moves forward in the 21st century, the island faces the challenge of balancing tradition with innovation, preserving cultural heritage while embracing technological change, and protecting natural environments while pursuing economic development. The solutions to these challenges will require the same creativity, resilience, and determination that have characterized Jamaican responses to previous historical challenges, from indigenous adaptation to tropical environments, through colonial resistance to post-independence nation building. The story of Jamaica, from its geological emergence through indigenous civilization, colonial transformation, and independent nationhood, demonstrates how geography and history interact to create unique places where human creativity can flourish despite significant challenges. The island that the Taíno called Xaymaca, land of wood and water, continues to live up to its name, providing abundant natural resources and inspiring cultural innovations that enrich not only Jamaica, but the entire world. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, picture contemporary Jamaica in all its complexity, an island where ancient mountains still produce world-class coffee, where coral reefs support both marine life and tourism, where music created in Kingston studios influences global culture, and where athletes from small communities become international legends. It's a place where geography continues to shape history, where natural beauty inspires human creativity, and where the challenges of the present build upon the achievements and struggles of the past. Sweet dreams, and may your own adventures, wherever they take you, be filled with the same spirit of resilience and joy that defines this remarkable Caribbean island.